the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, looking at the groups and teams of the 2023 African Cup, played in Ivory Coast in January 2024. This episode is looking at Group C: Senegal, Cameroon, Guinea, and Gambia. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada, Series 20. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Connor. And today we are looking at Group C for the African Cup 2023 tournament. This group includes Senegal, Cameroon, Guinea, and Gambia.
Yeah, and we usually give some information about our past, present, and future mediacasts at this point. But if you want that, we'll direct you to the video on our YouTube homepage, which covers that information. And the address is on the screen for YouTube viewers. For listeners, we recommend going to the YouTube page because it's well organized under playlists, and it is youtube.com/@soccerfiles. So we'll post that in the show notes for you.
For now, we'll just say that we are currently focused on the 2023 Asian and African Cups, both played in January 2024. So we are producing this group and team series as well as a player series for each.
Right, and we've posted the Asian Cup groups and teams, and now we're doing the African one, so let's get on with it.
Yeah, so this series previews the groups and teams for the African Cup 2023, which somewhat confusingly takes place in January 2024, as I said. So we're changing our usual format here because we did a full series for the 2021 African Cup, which was played in January 2022.
Yeah, there we did the usual overviews of World and African Cups, as well as a look at their local cup history a little bit. And that series featured a deep dive into the team's history in the African Cup finals. And it also examined the recent history of the teams.
Yeah, and we think it's too much to repeat that every 2 years. So in this series, we're only going to do that for the teams that were not involved in the 2021 African Cup. For those that were, we will provide links and even times in the show notes so that it can be easily reviewed.
Yeah, so in this series, for teams that were covered in the 2021 African Cup, we're going to give a summary of their history and also take a close look again at their recent history.
That's right. So yeah, why don't we look at the three sections in this mediacast just in outline?
Yeah, okay. So part one, we will introduce the teams or the countries in the group and give the location, population, nickname of each one.
For part two, we'll do an overview of each team's history and recent form. So as we mentioned, in the case of teams that did appear in the previous African Cup, this will be a summary with links in the show notes to the full version history done in 2021. And in the case of teams that were not covered in the previous tournament, we will give an overview of their world, regional, and local history with a deeper dive into their history in the African Cup finals.
Right, and actually in this group, all of them were involved in the 2021 African Cup, so it'll just be summaries here. Part three, the last part, will be a comparison of the teams in terms of ranking, head-to-head record, and odds, and we will end with a discussion of their prospects and our predictions.
All right, why don't we jump into it?
Okay, well, Connor, I have ordered a few international shirts, but I still don't have an African one, so I'm kind of vaguely wearing colors on the CAF logo. What do you think?
Not bad. The green, yellow, red, Pan-African colors actually represented in most of these flags, so you're doing pretty well.
Okay, I like to feel well-dressed for these things. Okay, well, let's begin with part one then, a kind of an overview of the countries, and you are going to take us through Senegal.
Yeah, so Senegal, their soccer nickname is the Lions of Teranga. Senegal's a mid-sized African country in terms of population with 17.7 million people. And it's also a small to mid-sized country geographically that's in West Africa, really on the edge of the Sahara. And Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal, is the most westerly point on the continent.
I did not know that. Okay, West Africa, down to Cameroon.
Yes, Cameroon. Their nickname is the Indomitable Lions. Cameroon's larger than Senegal with 28.6 million people. And it's a medium-sized country in kind of central West Africa on the Gulf of Guinea. And Cameroon borders 6 countries, but it shares its longest border with Nigeria to the west.
Right. Okay. So actually, quite far away from the other countries is Cameroon. Next one is Guinea. So going back up to where we were in Senegal.
Yeah. Their nickname is the Sili National, or the National Elephants. Their population is 14.2 million. And Guinea is another small to mid-sized country in sub-Saharan West Africa. And it actually shares a border with Senegal on the north of the country.
All right. And staying in that area, we look at Gambia.
Gambia, their nickname is the Scorpions. Really good nickname.
Uh-huh.
Their population is 2.7 million, so it's a small country, and it's quite small in terms of size too. It's actually a very long, skinny country that follows the outline of the Gambia River, which completely dissects it. And other than a small opening where the mouth of the river meets the Atlantic Ocean, it is completely surrounded by Senegal. So I know this meeting between Gambia and Senegal is much anticipated, given that, probably 95% of Gambia's border is with Senegal.
Right. Yeah. So 3 countries right near each other there. I'm sure there's some rivalry. Let's just kind of summarize then in comparison by going over the populations again. We'll go from biggest to smallest.
So the largest by population is Cameroon with 28.6 million. Next is Senegal with 17.7 million, so a little smaller. Not far behind is Guinea with 14.2 million. And then the smallest country, by some measure, is Gambia with just 2.7 million people.
All right. There we go. And that brings us to the end of part 1. And so we jump to part 2, Senegal, and we are just going to kind of summarize their history here.
So Senegal overall is a second-tier team, but they really waver between a first-tier and third-tier team in Africa. They've had 3 periods of strength, though only 2 of them are reflected in the World Cup. A good start in African Cup does not count really, as it was too short. And it was better than the long, weak period that followed. The early 90s saw 3 trips in a row beyond the group stage of the African Cup, but didn't reflect much in World Cup play. 4 trips past the African group stage from 2000 to 2006 reflected only in their 2002 World Cup appearance, though both of these periods did see more competitive performances in World Cup play. Their quarterfinal finish in the 2002 World Cup was a glory beyond imagine, and it was reflected in their second place finish in the African Cup that same year. That is the stuff of a top tier team, but they have only legitimized that in the current times, which is their third strong period and arguably the strongest, with an African Cup title and, for the first time, 2 trips in a row to the World Cup, including a round of 16 finish in 2002.
2022, I think.
That's right. Sorry, 2022, the most recent World Cup in Qatar.
Right. Yeah. So they are currently in the midst of a strong period, which we'll see because we're going to take a closer look now at their. We should actually talk a little bit about the local cup here, Connor. And actually, we focused on this quite a bit in the Asian region because the local cup seemed to play a bit of a bigger role there. I think for most of the African regions, the teams don't send their top players to the local cup. And a lot of them actually specifically limit it to players playing within Africa. 3 of the teams in this group, Senegal, well, the teams in the same area, Senegal, Guinea and Gambia, are all part of a group called WAFU, or the West African Football Union. And they have had a tournament from 2002, technically, because the 2002 tournament was abandoned. So really it goes from its renewal in 2010 up until 2019. They had a tournament scheduled for 2021, but that was postponed, and I haven't seen any revival of it in 2023. So anyway, Senegal is one of the strongest teams in the West African Football Union, and over the course of 6 tournaments, they have won one of them in 2019 and then finished second in 2 of them in 2010 and 2013 there. So we're actually going to start the recent thing just to kind of give you a taste of WAFU. With that tournament in 2019, which was actually hosted by Senegal. And it's an unusual structure. Maybe I should take us through this, Connor. Are you familiar with the plate trophy structure?
No, I'll let you talk us through it.
It's very odd. I've seen it in some old World Cup qualifications or some old regional cup qualifications. But basically it begins with what I called a sorting round. And the teams play each other, and if they win, they go to the trophy round, and if they lose, they go to the plate round. And each one of those rounds kind of is a tournament from the quarterfinals onwards. Yeah. So in 2019, Senegal beat Guinea-Bissau in the sorting round, so they went to the trophy route. And Guinea-Bissau went to the plate route, which we'll see when we get to Guinea and Gambia. And in the trophy quarterfinal, Senegal beat Benin and then Mali. And then in the final, they beat probably the strongest team in this WAFU region, which is Ghana. After tying 1-1, they beat them 3-1 on penalties. So that accounts for their first title in the WAFU region. What do you think?
Great. Yeah, an interesting setup. Like you said, it shows more kind of local players, but obviously Senegal having success at the African Cup level, to have success at the WAFU level too, shows kind of the strength of the country overall.
Yeah, it generally goes that way, that the countries that are strong on the regional or world level are strong in their local area too. Okay, well, let's move on with the recent history, and we'll look back at the last African Cup in 2021.
Yeah, so Senegal qualified comfortably, finishing first in their qualifying group ahead of Guinea-Bissau, Congo, and Eswatini, winning their first 4 games before kind of 2 draws cemented first place for them.
All right.
And then in the tournament itself, they started with the win over Zimbabwe, followed by 2 goalless draws against Guinea and Malawi. But those 5 points were enough to see them in first place in the group.
Just enough there, because they took a penalty at 90+7 for their single goal against Zimbabwe. So they were pretty lucky there.
Yeah, and that was the only goal in their 3 matches in the group stage, for or against. So
wow, 1 goal for, 0 goals against.
Yeah. In the round of 16, they kind of found their scoring boots though. They beat Cape Verde 2-0, then Equatorial Guinea and Burkina Faso both 3-1. Before the final with Egypt was 0-0 again. Senegal ultimately winning in penalties 4-2.
Yeah, and that game against Cape Verde was the refereeing was really terrible in that game, so it kind of dominated affairs. And Cape Verde took a questionable red card at 21, so they got a bit lucky there too.
Yeah. But it was an exciting run to the final that, of course, featured Liverpool's Sadio Mane versus Egypt's Mo Salah.
Yeah.
So it was highly anticipated, but Senegal winning it, becoming champions of Africa, and go into this one as the defending champions.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Despite a bit of an unconvincing group stage and a bit of luck along the way, they were a very strong looking team there. And they haven't always been, but it's yeah, it's a good showing for them. So they're carrying that into this cup. The next thing would be the 2021 WAFU Cup, the local cup again. But as mentioned, that tournament, though it was scheduled, was not played. So we don't know what's going on with that tournament, whether it's still alive or not. But the next thing is the 2022 World Cup campaign.
Yeah, Senegal were again impressive in qualifying, winning their 14 group ahead of Togo, Namibia, and Congo. With 5 wins and a single draw. And that set them up with a do-or-die home and away matchup with Egypt, the team they met in the African Cup finals. Both teams won the home game 1-0, so it came down to penalties once again, and Senegal were once again victorious, winning 3-1 on penalties to advance to the World Cup.
Yeah, each team missed their first 2 penalties, and Mohamed Salah missed his shot actually. So Senegal making it through there, so getting the best of Egypt twice in shootouts. How did they do in the tournament itself?
They started with a 2-0 defeat to Netherlands before beating host Qatar 3-1, and that set up a critical matchup with Ecuador, Senegal needing to win that game. But they did. They won 2-1 to finish second in the group and advance to the knockout round.
Right. And do you remember what we said when we did the podcast for this group?
In the World Cup?
What we predicted?
I was more big on Qatar. I think I might have said Qatar got through, but obviously that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we were both hoping Qatar could get through, and definitely gave them a better chance than they actually had. And I can't remember if we considered Senegal and Ecuador quite even, but I think that might be what we had said.
Yeah. It proved, Qatar not doing well, but it proved a competitive group otherwise. Senegal's second place finish in the group set up a match with England. And there they were less competitive. That game finished 3-0 to the Three Lions.
Yeah, so I would consider that a pretty successful tournament for Senegal.
Yeah, I mean, finishing ahead of the host is always a difficult thing to do. And, getting out of the group would have been their aim. And then kind of from there, it depends who you get and how it goes. England, of course, in a good period. So, yeah, overall, I would say successful.
Yeah, great. Okay, and now we move on to the last thing. It's qualifying for this cup, this African Cup, and let's take a look at how they got here.
Yeah, Senegal were strong once again, winning their first 4 games out of the gate before tying their next 2 to finish first in the group ahead of Mozambique, Benin, and Rwanda. So they finished first in the group, and Africa's pretty simple. It's a 4-team group, and top 2 advance, and Senegal were in that, and that's why they're here.
Yeah, and even those ties at the end with Benin and Rwanda, they were already guaranteed first place by that point. So maybe fielded a B team or something like that. But it looks like a weak finish, but it's actually more of a sign of their strength, I would argue.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're contemplating doing a section on their players, but we've decided to put that off because we will be doing a players podcast for these teams, and we also might be doing an update if there's kind of enough information, enough new information shortly before the tournament. So if we were to do an update, we would include a little section on players there. Here we'll just keep focusing on the team, so we move on to Cameroon and begin with their World Cup overview.
Yeah, we'll just.
Oh, sorry, no, this is the summary of Cameroon because we did the World Cup overview 2 years ago.
That's right. If we describe Cameroon's African Cup success in slow rolling waves, we have to say they did not match well with their World Cup record. Reaching the African Cup twice in the early 1970s was during a period where they were only mildly competitive in World Cup competition, but did not make it past the initial stages. Their first World Cup qualification in 1982 came before the high wave of the mid-80s, where they won 2 African Cup titles, but did not reach the World Cup. And their best performance of reaching the 1990 World Cup quarterfinals was actually a lull in their African Cup period. Their back-to-back African Cup titles in 2000 and 2002 came during a period where they were qualifying for the World Cup but not passing the group stage. A low of not reaching the World Cup in 2006 was followed by their best African Cup during the period, second place in 2008. African Cup from 2012 to 2015 did not affect their consistent World Cup qualification. And finally, their surprise African Cup title in 2017 compares with the non-qualification for the World Cup in 2018, which is only actually their second non-appearance at the World Cup since 1990.
Yeah,
so very interesting.
quite. It really is. I mean, when they're doing well in World Cup, they're not doing well in African Cup, and vice versa. So I wonder where would that leave them for this cup?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they got to the World Cup, though didn't advance. So maybe a bit ambiguous, but it's really interesting. You think some teams go for golden generations where they have big periods of success over a short amount of time, and for Cameroon, the difference between their play in World Cup and African Cup is just striking for the inconsistency between the two of them.
Yeah, it really is. It's uncanny, really. Okay, well, let's go to a look at their local cup, and I'll talk about this one, but not in too much detail. Basically, they're in a Central African group called UNICAF. It's actually a French acronym, so there's no point in saying more than that it's a Central African group. And they've had a tournament actually for a long time. On the screen for YouTube watchers, you'll see I've done it from 1984, where they had a tournament every year called the UDAC tournament. There were actually a couple of tournaments before that kind of started and failed. So this one was a bit more successful than the others. And that went every year from 1984 to 1990. And then it changed into the CMAC tournament, which ran from 2003 to 2014. And since then, they haven't had any tournament, any local tournament. So again, the local scene a bit less important in Africa than it was in Asia. They did well. They won 4 of the 7 UDAC tournaments between 1984 and 1990, but actually only 3 of, let me see how many, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 3 of 10 CMAC tournaments. So again, it's kind of obvious that they're not sending their best teams to this tournament. Any comments on that before we move on, Connor?
No, it's a bit too bad they haven't played in almost a decade. This tournament, it just kind of keeps to kind of just for continuity and keep track of how different teams are doing. But I guess it is what it is.
Yeah, it's a bit actually more useful for some of the weaker teams, but for teams like Senegal, they're sending kind of completely different set of players to these tournaments, so it doesn't really inform on the team that much. Let's move on to Cameroon's recent history, beginning with the 2021 African Cup, and see how they did there.
So despite hosting the tournament, Cameroon still went through qualification. They finished first in the group, but were actually bested by Cape Verde. Cape Verde beating them and tying them. But Cameroon finished a point ahead, and both teams qualified for the tournament. And then at the tournament itself, Cameroon picked up 7 points in the group stage with wins over Burkina Faso and Ethiopia, and a draw with Cape Verde, who they met again. In the round of 16, they squeaked past the surprising Comoros 2-1. then beat another upstart Gambia in the quarterfinal before losing in penalties to Egypt in the semifinal match. In the third place match, they had a thrilling 3-3 draw with Burkina Faso and then ended up winning in penalties. So they picked up the bronze medal at home.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe a bit disappointing as hosts. They probably would have wanted to reach the final. But some funny details there. You mentioned the poor Comoros team. They were ravaged with COVID actually for that game against Cameroon. So they had to put a defender in net to play the whole game. Can you imagine?
No, and not only that, they got a red card 7 minutes into the game as well.
Yeah, it seemed like everybody felt bad about that. Like even Cameroon, we were all like, "Oh, that's sad."
Yeah, and it only finished 2-1. It made the home fans nervous despite all the advantages Cameroon had. It was a very entertaining game, I must say.
It was, and the keeper did make actually a couple of good saves, even if they were a bit clumsy. So I think even the Cameroon fans were pulling for the guy.
Yeah. And then we'll just say in the Burkina Faso match, Cameroon was actually down 3-0 in that match before coming back. And actually they scored goals at 85 and 87 to send it to penalties where they ultimately won. So that was another thrilling game. A good way to end it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like a bit of a win if you're coming back from 3-0 down to win the game.
For sure.
Super. Okay, let's move on to the World Cup 2022 to see how they did.
Yeah, Cameroon were in kind of a highly anticipated group with Ivory Coast. Only one of those teams was going to advance from the group. So a very tight group by the look of it. And so it proved Cameroon and Ivory Coast swapped home wins. But then Ivory Coast had a draw with Mozambique that ultimately cost them, Malawi, the other team. So Cameroon finished first, 2 points ahead of Ivory Coast. And that set them up with a home and away playoff against Algeria. Both teams won 1-0 on the road, kind of unusual for Africa. But Cameroon scored a golden goal, or not a golden goal, I suppose, but an extra time winner past the 90th minute mark in Algeria to win and go to the World Cup.
Yeah, well, just on that, it was actually 2-1 in extra time. So it went to extra time, and after having a goal disallowed on a VAR ruling, Algeria seemed to actually earn the berth on a goal at 118 minutes, so 2 minutes before the end of extra time there, only to have Cameroon score late into extra time and seize the advancing spot on the away goals rule.
Wow. What drama. I mean, Algeria think they scored 118 and they think they booked their place to Qatar, only to lose it from there. It's just incredible.
It is. It's that is so dramatic. Wow. Okay, but it was Cameroon going through to the World Cup. So how did they do there?
They lost their first match to Switzerland and then tied Serbia 3-3 in kind of one of the underrated games of the World Cup. And although they were eliminated by this point, in their last match with Brazil, who had qualified for the next round, Cameroon beat them 1-0, scoring a goal in stoppage time in the second half. So Cameroon beat Brazil, but it wasn't enough to get out of the group stage, unfortunately. They finished third on 4 points, but a glorious way to end a World Cup, I suppose.
Yeah, I think actually they weren't out of it by the end of the second game, but they would have needed Switzerland basically to lose their game, and right. Switzerland won their game. But it was kind of funny. The guy who scored the goal took off his shirt in celebration of a late goal, an extra time goal against Brazil, even though it was Brazil's B team because they were already through. And he got a yellow card for it, but it was his second yellow card. So basically got a red card for scoring against Brazil.
Yeah, that was Vincent Abubakar as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So always entertaining Cameroon there. And the last thing we'll look at here, well, again, there's no local cup for us to do because the last local cup for Cameroon was in 2014. So we can't even look at kind of that group of Central African countries. We got to move on to the 2023 African Cup qualifying. So how did they reach this tournament?
Well, their 4-team group was reduced to 3 after Kenya were disqualified from the group, leaving just Cameroon, Namibia, and Burundi. And Cameroon finished first in the group, but labored a little bit. They were actually bested by Namibia, and then winning the other 2 against Burundi. So they got through, but probably not all that impressively, you must say.
Yeah, they really kind of maybe took it too easy there. Kenya, the team that was disqualified, was the pot 2 team and a fairly weak pot 2 team at that. So Cameroon were just left with the pot 3 and 4 team. It should have been an easier ride than it was, but good for Namibia there.
Yeah.
Who also made it through to the cup, actually. So once again, we won't look at their players, but maybe we will do in an update podcast, and definitely will do in the player podcast. So we move on to Team 3, Guinea. And again, they were part of the 2021 African Cup that we covered 2 years ago. And so we're just going to do the same kind of summary of their World and African Cups. Yeah.
So Guinea is a second-tier team, underperforming in World Cup play and arguably overperforming in African Cup play. As a second-tier team, they should sometimes be challenging in the final round or even reaching the World Cup at some point in their history. However, they've never come close except once in 1998. In the Asian Cup, a second-tier team usually reaches the cup and sometimes passes the group stage, so Guinea not able to do that. Guinea have reached more than half of the African Cup since 2004 and have overperformed by usually passing the group stage. They have missed only 3 cups since 2004, an improvement over their pre-millennium record of reaching only the odd cup. However, their second place finish in 1976 remains by far their best result, as the quarterfinal has proven their limit in recent times.
Yeah, so what do you make of that? A bit kind of passing the group stage in the African Cup, about half the times since the turn of the century, but not competitive at all in the World Cup qualifications.
Yeah, kind of like we saw with Cameroon, a bit of a strange dichotomy there. Like you said, I think second-tier teams suits them because they are very competitive at the African Cup level and have kind of established themselves as, regulars more or less. So I think for them, it's just the logical next step is trying to get to the World Cup, which, they have a shot at doing, especially as Africa's spots are going to increase in number with the expanded World Cup going forward. So I think the World Cup has to be their aim now.
Yeah, well, the World Cup is expanding to 48 teams, which might give second-tier teams like Guinea a look in. I mean, until now, it's just been 5 teams, so it's always been the top team, with the odd weird exceptions of like Angola and Togo. But in terms of being competitive to reach it, I think the second-tier teams, we might start seeing some teams like Guinea getting there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take a look at their local cup, and we can do this quickly because it's the same one as Senegal, the WAFU Cup. So basically just 6 editions between 2010 and 2019. And we'll take a look at the 2019 one in their recent performances. That was their best performance. In fact, they only entered 3 of the 6 cups there and generally were knocked out early, but did a bit better in 2019. And actually we'll go straight to that because that's the first recent tournament we will look at.
Yeah, so Guinea lost their opening match, which was the sorting round. They lost to Benin, so that sent them to the kind of the second tier plate tournament. But there they did well and actually won it, beating Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, and Cape Verde in the finals, winning the final 4-3 on penalties.
Yeah, so as you can see with that structure, it's the first game is very important. But I wonder, Guinea probably got more glory out of losing that first game than they would have had they gone to the trophy round.
Yeah.
Okay, next we look at the African Cup in 2021 and Guinea's progress towards it.
Yeah, so in terms of qualifying, they won all 3 games at home over Namibia, Chad, and Mali, but actually failed to win a game on the road. However, they did finish second place, 2 points behind group winners Mali and 2 points ahead of third place Namibia, and that second place finish was enough to qualify for the tournament.
Yeah, they did well to best Mali there. Mali is generally a stronger team than Guinea, so it was the road record that kind of undid them there.
Yeah. Once at the tournament, they beat Malawi in their opener, tied Senegal, who they'll meet for a second straight tournament here, and then actually lost to last place Zimbabwe when they could have topped the group. But as it was, they finished second.
Yeah, so that looks like a pretty disappointing finish for Guinea, losing to Zimbabwe after tying Senegal. But actually, they came through fairly well because they got a pretty gentle round of 16 pairing there.
Yeah, they did in meeting Gambia, the first timers, and Guinea would have been favorite. So really disappointing for them to lose that match in the manner they did, 1-0.
Yeah, definitely. If they had won the group, they would have had Comoros. I don't think that's necessarily that much easier. Okay, let's move on. Now, we would be doing a look at the WAFU 2021 Cup here. However, that tournament wasn't played, so that tournament is kind of up in the air. So we move on to the 2022 World Cup campaign for Guinea.
Yeah, their campaign was a bit strange, actually. It was interrupted by a coup in their country. But on top of that, they actually tied 4 games. They tied both home and away against Sudan and Guinea-Bissau, and then lost both their games by 3-goal margins to Morocco. So they only collected 4 points and actually finished 3rd out of 4 in the group stage. So they didn't advance to the playoff round.
Yeah, a pretty disappointing campaign there, even though Morocco kind of had it all the way. But yeah, 3rd behind Guinea-Bissau is definitely disappointing. Okay, now the last one is how they reached this cup, so the 2023 African Cup qualifying campaign.
Yeah, so Guinea finished with 3 wins and a draw in their 4 games against Malawi and Ethiopia, so teams they should be doing well against, and then lost both to Egypt, home and away. So kind of like World Cup qualifying, they proved kind of not quite competitive with really top tier teams in Africa. However, their 10 points saw them comfortably finish 2nd out of 4 in the group, behind Egypt, and qualify for this tournament.
Yeah, a little drama there in 3 of the 6 games kind of decided on late goals. The first one was Egypt scoring a late goal at home there to beat them. But in 2 cases, they were the ones to get the late goals. So came out in 2nd as a result. Okay, let us again skip the players and move on to Gambia, another interesting one for you here, Connor.
Yeah. In terms of strength, Gambia is really a 4th tier team for most of their history, even in recent times. However, they have had a few kind of 3rd tier campaigns and have sometimes surprised with stronger campaigns yet. 4th tier teams are generally knocked out in preliminary rounds, and that is the case for most of their World Cup history, even in recent campaigns. And it's also true for much of their African Cup history. However, from 2004, they have been a bit more competitive in their campaigns, something only true of their 2010 and 2014 World Cup runs. In these kind of 3rd tier performances, they are competitive at the game level, sometimes even with strong teams in Gambia's case, but they do not pass the round, often finishing near the bottom. In the 2010 World Cup campaign, they were competitive with top-tier teams Algeria and Senegal, the three finishing just 1 point apart at the top of the table, but only Algeria advanced. In 2021, they not only qualified for the African Cup for the first time, but passed the round of 16 to reach the quarterfinals. That seemed another flash in the pan when they were knocked out in the preliminary round of the 2022 World Cup, but another solid performance saw them reach the 2023 African Cup.
Yeah, so hard to know what to make of this team. We kind of maybe glossed over it a bit in that 2010 World Cup campaign, and even on the graphic, it doesn't stand out. But the fact is, the group finished Algeria, I think, 10 points, Gambia 9 points, and Senegal 9 points. Like, that is amazing for a team that's really knocked out in the preliminary round most of the time.
Yeah, it really is. And you're right, it's a bit hard to place. I mean, they seem to have a strong generation now. Reaching 2 African Cups is a great achievement for them. Whether this will amount to anything in the kind of the short to medium term, I guess it yet remains to be seen, but certainly an achievement qualifying for 2 cups in a row, their first 2 in their history.
I mean, that is a good achievement, partly a result of the tournament expanding, but they are a 4th-tier team. But in between those 2 qualifications, they got knocked out in the preliminary round, as we'll see. So really hard to put a finger on Gambia. Let's begin that with the local cup overview. Again, they are part of WAFA, and they actually didn't enter or withdrew from the first 3 tournaments since 2010, and basically got knocked out early in 2017, and we'll take a closer look at their most successful campaign in 2019. In fact, that's the next thing we're going to look at. So do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, so they lost their opener in the sorting round to Ghana, a very strong team, obviously. So they moved on to the plate round, and there they overcame Mauritania in penalties after a 0-0 draw. And then in the semifinal, they lost narrowly to Cape Verde. So semifinal finish in the plate round. Not a long history in this tournament, but a decent performance.
Yeah. Again, for a team that is often a 4th-tier team, it's a reasonably good performance, especially losing just 1-0 to Ghana there in the sorting round. So they weren't overwhelmed. Okay, but let's take a look at their African Cup in 2021, and we see this is one of their better performances for sure.
Well, remarkably, Gambia were one of the 8 weakest teams in the African region. It's out of about 54 teams, I believe. So they had to undergo a preliminary round, and they just squeezed past Djibouti only on a penalty shootout. So it was hardly a harbinger of things to come.
Yeah.
But in the 14 group stage, they started with an away win over Angola, and then tied Congo DR, a strong team. They lost to Gabon, but then crucially, they won their next 2 games at home to Gabon and Angola. And they actually finished first place in an extremely tight group. It was Gambia 10 points, Gabon 10 points, and Congo DR 9. But Gambia, again, after that inauspicious start with Djibouti, topped the group and qualified for their first African Cup.
Yeah. Again, that competitiveness with Djibouti really is more in character for them than finishing on top of the group the way they did here. Congo DR was the pot 1 team there, but finished 3rd, so they're an interesting story too.
Yeah.
Anyway, Gambia did get through to the African Cup for the first time. So how did they do once there?
Again, their kind of exceeding expectations continued. They opened with a win over Mauritania, then tied Mali before beating Tunisia to finish tied for first in the group, actually second, just behind Mali on goal difference. So they not only qualified for their first African Cup, but advanced out of the group stage. And there they beat Guinea, who we talked about earlier, before losing to Cameroon in the quarterfinal. So they're grouped with both those two teams again, but a quarterfinal finish in their debut, very impressive.
Really beyond expectation. They're a funny team. You know, the going back to the group stage, they actually equalized against Mali right at the end of the game. But their goal against Tunisia was hilarious because I was just baffled when watching it. But the referee kind of gave a red card to a Tunisian player, but there was some confusion about it because the Tunisian player didn't go off. It wasn't a protest or anything. It was confusion. I think, I can't remember exactly. He thought he got a yellow or something. But in the confusion, Gambia played on and scored a late winner.
Yeah, I remember it being bizarre.
It was bizarre, and I've looked at it a couple of times. I still don't really get what happened with that one, but anyway, Gambia surprising once again, and
Yes.
again no WAFA Cup in 2021. So we move on to the World Cup. After that tremendous success, how did they do in World Cup play?
They were among the bottom 28 teams that had to play in basically a preliminary knockout round, and Gambia lost both matches, the home and the away match, to Angola. So kind of reverting back to their historical mean, they didn't even qualify for the group stage.
Yeah, and actually having beaten Angola home and away in the 2021 African Cup qualifying, they lose both legs here. So yeah, really hard to characterize which Gambia is going to come out, the strong form or the weak form. Well, obviously they're at the African Cup here, so it was more the strong form that came out in qualifying here. But take us through how they got here.
Yeah, once again, though, it had to start in a qualifying round. They were among the 12 weakest teams in the region that had to play in the preliminary, which might seem a bit harsh considering they were in the top. They reached the quarterfinals of the last African Cup. But nevertheless, they were in the preliminary round, and they won 3-2 on aggregate over Chad.
Yeah, that too was just squeezing by because if you look at it, Chad was up 2-1 in Gambia. And so if it had ended that way, Chad would have gone through on away goals. But once again, Gambia get a late goal. They snatch an equalizer on a penalty at 90+2 and just squeeze through the preliminary round again.
Yeah, unbelievable that they just survived and then qualified impressively. They were undefeated at home. They actually won home and away over South Sudan, but then also picked up a win over Mali and got a point over against Congo as well. So they finished with 10 points, 5 behind Mali, who were group winners, but 3 ahead of the Congo, and then South Sudan finished last. So despite being bested by Congo, their consistency and that crucial home win over Mali saw them through in second place.
And that's another feature of Gambia all through their history, but we can see it in this recent history too, that, when they do kind of take points, it doesn't matter who it's against. Like they take points off the top teams as readily as they lose points to the weak teams. Of course, it doesn't happen that often, but they have an incredible kind of list of teams that they've taken points off, which I guess we'll see a bit when we get to the head-to-head. And well, actually, we are getting towards the head-to-head because we finished now the history of all 4 teams. So I'm moving on to part 3. Before we look at the head-to-head, though, we look at the pots that they came from and where within that pot they were.
Yeah, so the pot 1 team is Senegal. They're actually the second highest ranked team in Africa going into this tournament, just behind Morocco, but Senegal are 20th in the world, so quite a strong pot 1 team. Cameroon are the second ranked team in pot 2. They're 41st in the world. Guinea are third from pot 3. And then Gambia actually come in as the second lowest ranked team in the tournament. So overall, kind of teams coming from the top or middle of the pots, with the exception of Gambia, who, again, are ranked low but should not be underestimated.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, I don't think Senegalese will like to hear this, but at almost any other point in history, it would probably be Cameroon in pot 1 and Senegal in pot 2. So, an interesting feature there too.
Yeah, we kind of look at this to gauge the relative strength of the group, but I think another way of looking at it is that all 4 of these teams were in the African Cup last year, but not only that, all 4 advanced out of the group stage.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it's quite a strong team when you look at what happened just 2 years ago in the most recent African Cup.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't think we're going to see any other groups where all teams made it out of the group stage. So yeah, well put. So that's my sense too, that it is a fairly strong group. Let's look at the FIFA and the ELO rankings.
Yeah, so Senegal are 20th in FIFA and 34th in ELO. Senegal, of course, rising a little bit after their successes of the African Cup and World Cup qualification. So they've been actually around 20th or higher for the past several years in FIFA and within the 30s, basically in ELO. So they've been fairly consistent recently, and that was a rise from where they had come from, kind of being in the 40s or even below that.
Right, yeah, and 20th in the world is pretty impressive, and I think it's justified. Their last 2 African Cups, they've looked pretty strong in those. They kind of showed it in the World Cup, but I kind of wish they would have showed it a bit more. Sadio Mane was injured for the World Cup, so that was a blow to them.
Yeah, massive. Cameroon are 41st in FIFA and 51st in ELO. They actually come in as a 7th ranked team in the African Cup, so they're pretty strong. Made it to 3rd place last time. They've dipped a little bit since the high of the Qatar World Cup, when they were 33rd in FIFA and 47th in ELO. But they're a little bit higher than probably their historical average, which is kind of in the 50s range over the last several years.
Yeah, well, we saw in their history that they're really kind of, when they're up in the World Cup, they're down in the African Cup, and vice versa. So it's kind of hard to maintain a high average. Missed 3 African Cups in a row there in the mid 2010s. I think it's hard for them to kind of build their ranking when they're kind of inconsistent that way.
Yeah. The pot 3 team Guinea, they're 81st in FIFA and 98th in ELO. They've kind of been just above 100 in ELO and kind of around the 70 to 80 mark in FIFA for the last couple of years, sometimes above 60s. And yeah, with kind of consistency in African Cups and not great showings in the World Cup, they've remained, relatively steady, though perhaps actually a little bit of a drop, in recent years.
Yeah, over time. I mean, 10 years ago, they were around the area where Cameroon is now, so would have been more competitive with them. So obviously, they would kind of like to get back to that level, but haven't been there in quite a while.
Yeah. Gambia, meanwhile, are 118th in FIFA, but 93rd in ELO. So interestingly, they're actually ahead of Guinea in the ELO rankings. I think the ELO is probably a little bit more generous, and maybe rightly so, given their achievements in the last African Cup. But in any case, it's a remarkable rise from Gambia. Again, they're a 4th-tier team historically, so they've been in the 160s, 170s in FIFA, 140s in ELO. So by any stretch, it's a sharp rise of about 50 places in both systems in recent years.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable rise on the strength, really, just of the the two African Cups there. So the big question for Gambia, of course, is which version of them is going to come out, which I suppose we'll get to in our discussion. But for the time being, let's take a look at the head-to-head records. We begin with, well, you take us through that, and I'll add any details that are relevant.
Yeah, so Senegal has a winning but competitive record against Guinea. 6 wins, 4 draws, and 4 losses for Senegal.
Yeah, they've only met once recently. That was, as we saw in the 2021 African Cup group stage, and there they tied. So that bodes further competitiveness here, perhaps.
Yeah, next we have Senegal, Gambia. These two very close neighbors. Senegal's won 1 match. They've tied 3, and Gambia hasn't won, but kind of true to form, they can get points against good teams.
Yeah, that really illustrates what I say. Not that Senegal is always as strong a team as they are now, but the most recent meeting was in 2010 World Cup qualifying, and they tied both legs there. So that also maybe promises a bit of competitiveness here too.
Yeah, next is Cameroon versus Senegal, kind of the two biggest teams in the group. And here it's close. Cameroon with 3 wins, 1 draw, and Senegal with 2 wins.
Yeah, so historically, Cameroon is probably a stronger team than Senegal, but very competitive here too. They met in the 2002 African Cup final and went to penalties where Cameroon won. And in the 2017 African Cup quarterfinal, again going to penalties and again Cameroon winning there.
Yeah, so close encounters though.
Mm-hmm.
Cameroon versus Guinea. Cameroon has won 4. They have 3 draws, and there's just 1 win for Guinea.
Yeah, and their most recent meeting was in 2015, and they tied that game. So we're getting competitiveness all around here, although Cameroon has a pretty strong record over Guinea on the whole.
Yeah, against Gambia, Cameroon has 3 wins from 3 matches, so strong there.
Yeah, and they've actually, all 3 of those games are fairly recent. 2 of them in 2017 African Cup qualifying, and the other in the 2021 African Cup quarterfinal, as we saw Cameroon winning them all.
And then finally, Guinea has a winning record over Gambia, record of 4 wins, 2 draws, and 1 defeat.
Yeah, so again, we see Guinea kind of not looking as strong nowadays as their historical record is, and that single defeat they suffered was, as we saw in the 2021 African Cup round of 16. So that was actually the first time that Gambia got the better of Guinea.
Yeah, so some interesting results recently among all 4 teams, some recent ties, and also some very recent meetings, including in the last African Cup.
Yeah, that's right. So it gives us a lot to go on. Now, at this point, we do try to find odds, not that we encourage gambling, but it's interesting to see what those guys, odds makers, think about it. However, we haven't been able to find odds for kind of group winners on the whole, so we'll kind of have to create our own odds, Connor.
Yeah, well, we'll do that through our discussion.
Let's begin with that, and I'm gonna say I'm gonna begin with Senegal. Are in a good period right now. They're not always as strong as they are right now. Do you think they will hold through this tournament, or kind of return to the mean a little bit?
I do think they'll hold through this tournament. I think they'll have some good confidence as defending champions and doing reasonably well in the World Cup, even without Sadio Mane. They've got very strong players, playing in top leagues. And the other thing with Senegal, they did get off to a slightly weaker start, as we saw in the last African Cup. Not all that convincing in the group stage, but then they grew into the tournament. So I think Senegal will be strong. I definitely think they'll get out, but it's possible we may see them grow into the tournament again, which could open them up to points being dropped at the group stage.
It's a good point. I think if they start this tournament the same way, they could suffer by it. a little bit more than they did in the last African Cup. We said this is a pretty tough group, and yeah, I guess that should be a bit of a concern for them. Yeah, my own thinking on Senegal is I'm not sure. I'll have to do kind of the player podcast. I mean, Sadio Mane moved to Bayern Munich, but then didn't do well there, right?
Yeah, and he's now in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering about a couple of the other big names on this team. I've kind of lost track of the defender Koulibaly. Do you know where he got to?
I think he's in Saudi Arabia as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I mean, some of the big players may be aging out a bit. As you say, they have a very strong squad, and they managed without Sadio Mane well enough in the World Cup. So they seem to have the supporting cast to keep up the strength. But I am a bit concerned in that Cameroon historically is a stronger team. So if Senegal kind of doesn't keep up that form and Cameroon kind of rediscovers better form, it could add up to a bit of a challenge here. But as you say, I mean, it's very unlikely that they wouldn't pass the group stage.
Yeah, I mean, with Cameroon, you have, with Senegal, 2 teams that made it to the last 4 of the African Cup, actually finished in the top 3, and 2 teams that were among the 5 to reach the last World Cup. So it's going to be very interesting. Cameroon are a good team. I think that Cameroon versus Senegal is going to be one of the kind of the games of the first round, or has the potential to be. And, Cameroon, strong team that they typically come in as a Group 1 seed, as you alluded to. So they're often favorites to win the group. So I think it could be quite competitive. I probably favor Senegal, but I think Cameroon are strong and capable of winning the group.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I'd have to give the nod to Cameroon at this point. Another thing is that even though they did both pass the group stage in the World Cup, Senegal was a bit more convincingly so than Cameroon.
Yeah, I guess Cameroon actually didn't pass the group stage, but they did have that famous win over Brazil.
Oh, yes, right. I had that in mind, and I thought that got them through. But right. Yeah, so I mean, Senegal kind of edging on every point now, except for the longer history, and we'll see how that plays out. Do you give any chance for Guinea or Gambia to challenge those two?
Definitely. I think that both teams are capable. I see Gambia as, unpredictable in a sense. They could lose the game 4-0, or they could win 1-0 on a late goal. Like, neither kind of surprises me. So, yeah, and Guinea are, we kind of talked about them as a second-tier team. A team that often gets out of the group stage. So, yeah, I see it possible that Gambia or Guinea kind of takes points or even beats anyone in this group. I think they're capable of it on their day.
Yeah, I think especially taking points may be the key. I mean, I think Gambia could actually take points in the form of beating the team. You never know what they're going to do. But it seems like they'll at least play a spoiler role because they're a bit difficult to manage. And Guinea, to me, was a bit of a stronger team in the past. So a bit like Cameroon, if they rediscover a bit of their form, they could challenge beyond their pot 3 level here. So I also give both of them a chance. There's always room for them to pass in 3rd place, which I believe Guinea did last time. No, they finished in 2nd. Anyway, there is room for a 3rd place team. A 3rd place team would be one of the teams in a competitive group. Is that right?
Typically, yeah. Typically, a group where one team dominates and one team falls completely flat. You may not always see it, but a competitive group with everyone takes points off each other. I mean, last time Senegal's group saw points go 5-4, 4-3. And 3 teams advance. So a situation like that would definitely see a 3rd place team advance again.
Yeah. I kind of think anything could happen in this group. Senegal could dominate and leave the others behind, but there's enough evidence to suggest a bit of competitiveness here.
Yeah, how do you see Gambia and Guinea in terms of relative strength? Elo has Gambia higher.
I gotta say, I mean, Gambia is for the most part a fourth tier team. So we saw them get knocked out in the preliminary round in the 2018 and 2022 cups. I'm not saying that they're kind of lucky to be here, but I mean they're lucky to be here because they almost got knocked out by Chad in the preliminary round of this competition too. So I do think they can be troublesome, but I think on the whole, they're a fairly weak team and really played above their level in 2021. But I'm not convinced that they can really do that again. So I consider Guinea quite a bit stronger. I see Guinea possibly passing through in third place or even challenging Cameroon because they're a bit inconsistent. But I don't see Gambia really doing that. How about you?
I certainly give Gambia the surprise factor. I think they could be competitive, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them win one out of these three games. And if they do, who knows where that could take them. So, Gambia is a little bit harder to predict. I don't think Guinea are, at the level of Senegal or Cameroon, and that may show. But I almost favor Gambia for a shock result.
Oh, really? Well, I mean, they did beat Guinea in the round of 16 last time, so you can't discount that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, put your money where your mouth is. Are you telling me that you're picking Gambia in third, perhaps even to go through in third? Come on, lay it out, Connor.
I'm going to say Senegal first, Cameroon second, Gambia third, and Guinea fourth.
Wow.
Gambia also has a Cardiff City player in Ebu Adam, so maybe that biases me somewhat. I would like to see Gambia's good run continue. I think they'll be competitive. I think this will be a very competitive group. I'm very excited for this group. Lots of good teams. Lots of teams looking to build on the last African Cup. But that's the order as I predict it.
All right. Well, that's bold indeed. I'm going to go, despite all our discussion, according to part order, although I do think it will be competitive here, but I'm going Senegal, Cameroon, Guinea, and Gambia. And I think there is room for surprises here. The surprise you're calling is Gambia challenging, but I think a surprise could happen at any level. Cameroon finishing first over Senegal, or Guinea over Cameroon, but I think the standard order is what I would go with. We might be eating our words, though. We should really be making a little pool, a points pool, to see how we did in our predictions.
True. I do agree, though, that I think this group will be competitive at every level, and I think all 6 games will probably be competitive too.
Yeah, me too.
At least.
Yeah, I think it'll be a really interesting group, and I wouldn't really be shocked by any outcome. I don't think even Gambia finishing first wouldn't utterly shock me,
Right.
Okay, well, a competitive Group C here, and we will move on to Group D next, and hopefully see as exciting a group there as we've seen here. Anything more to add, or should we sign off, Connor?
We'll sign off. I think this will be a great group, and I'm looking forward to it.
We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.